The huge metal doors of the Galactic Council building opened with a deep sound that made everyone inside feel nervous. Today was different from other days. The air felt heavy and thick, like before a big storm comes. Thousands of beings from all over the galaxy sat in their special seats, each designed for their different body types. Ambassador Sarah Chen walked into the main hall, wearing her simple blue Earth uniform. She looked calm on the outside, but inside her heart was beating fast. In her hands she carried a small data pad that held proof of something terrible, something that would change everything between humans and the rest of the galaxy. For 300 years, humans had been the ones everyone called when there was trouble. When two species could not agree on something, they called humans. When trade deals went wrong, they called humans. When wars were about to start, they called humans to stop them. Humans were good at listening to everyone and finding ways to make peace. The Galactic Council had 1,047 different species in it. Some looked like giant lizards with green scales. Others looked like floating jellyfish made of light. Some were tiny and furry, while others were made of living metal. They all spoke different languages and thought in different ways, but somehow, humans could talk to all of them and help them understand each other. Sarah remembered her first day as an ambassador 15 years ago. Her teacher, an old human named Marcus Webb, had told her something important. "Sarah," he had said, "other species think we humans are not very smart compared to them. They think we are too young and too emotional. But we have something they do not have. We can put ourselves in someone else's place and feel what they feel. That is our gift to the galaxy." Now Sarah stood in front of all these different beings, and she was about to prove that her teacher was right about humans being different. But today that difference would not help make peace. Today it would start the biggest problem the galaxy had ever seen. Chancellor Vexithulu was the leader of the Tall Greys. The Tall Greys were a species that looked like very thin humans, but they were 8 feet tall with gray skin and big black eyes. They thought they were the smartest beings in the galaxy. Chancellor Vexithulu sat on the highest seat in the room, looking down at everyone else. "The emergency meeting will now begin," Chancellor Vexithulu said in his cold, emotionless voice. "We are here to talk about the recent attacks on trade ships in the outer rim area of space. These attacks have hurt our economy and made many species afraid to travel." Sarah took a deep breath. She knew what was coming next, and she was ready for it. "The evidence clearly shows," Chancellor Vexithulu continued, "that these attacks were planned and carried out by human criminals. The human government has failed to control their own people, and now innocent beings are suffering because of human greed and violence." The room exploded with noise. Thousands of different voices started talking at once. Some were making angry sounds, others were making sad whistling noises, and some were clicking their teeth together fast. The translation machines worked hard to change all these sounds into words that everyone could understand. Sarah stood up slowly. The room became quiet as everyone looked at her. Her hands were shaking a little, but her voice was strong when she spoke. "Honorable council members," she began, "I have spent the last 6 months investigating these attacks. I have traveled to 12 different star systems. I have interviewed 847 witnesses. I have looked at wreckage from 34 different ships, and I have found the truth." She held up her data pad. The information on it was displayed on huge screens around the room so everyone could see it. "These attacks were not done by humans," Sarah said clearly. "They were done by the Tall Grey hegemony's own secret military teams. The Tall Greys attacked their own people and blamed humans for it." The room became so quiet that everyone could hear the air recycling systems humming. Chancellor Vexithulu's big black eyes became even bigger. "That is impossible," he said, but his voice sounded less sure than before. Sarah pressed a button on her data pad. A video started playing on their screens. It showed tall gray soldiers in unmarked ships attacking a trade vessel. Their faces were clearly visible. Their ship identification numbers could be seen. There was no way to deny what the video showed. "This video was recovered from a hidden camera on one of the attacked ships," Sarah explained. "The tall gray soldiers thought they had destroyed all the evidence, but they missed this one camera." She pressed another button. Documents appeared on the screen showing orders from high-ranking tall gray officials. The orders clearly told the soldiers to attack trade ships and make it look like humans did it. The plan was simple, Sarah continued. Create fear of humans in the galaxy. Make other species think humans are dangerous. Then when the Council gets rid of humans from all peacekeeping jobs, the tall grays would take over those jobs. They would become the new leaders of galactic peace with much more power than they have now. Chancellor Vexthulu stood up fast, knocking over his water container. The strange blue liquid spilled all over his desk. "This is fake information," he shouted. "Humans are trying to trick you all. They created these false videos and documents to hide their crimes." But Sarah was ready for this too. She pressed another button and more evidence appeared. Communication records showed messages between tall gray officials talking about their plan. Financial records showed payments to the secret soldiers. Ship tracking data showed tall gray vessels in the areas where attacks happened. All of this evidence has been checked by the Crystalline Concordate's best computer systems, Sarah said. Their computers cannot be fooled or hacked. They have confirmed that none of this evidence is fake. The Crystalline Concordate was a species made of living crystal that was famous for being completely honest. If they said something was true, then it was definitely true. Many council members started making angry noises at Chancellor Vexthulu. The reptilian sovereignty delegates were hissing loudly. The Aquatic Federation representatives were changing colors rapidly, which meant they were very upset. Even some of the tall gray's own allies were looking shocked and angry. But then something unexpected happened. Instead of apologizing or admitting his guilt, Chancellor Vexthulu pointed his long gray finger at Sarah. "Even if this evidence is real," he said, "it does not matter. Humans are still too dangerous to have power in this galaxy. They are too emotional, too violent, too unpredictable. Look at how they have acted today, accusing a senior council member without proper procedures. This proves that humans cannot be trusted with important responsibilities." Other species that had always been jealous of human success started agreeing with him. The Biomechanical Collective, who had lost several important jobs to human mediators, began making mechanical clicking sounds that meant agreement. The Geometric Hierarchy, who believed that only logical mathematical beings should have power, started flashing their lights in support. "I call for an immediate vote, Chancellor," Vexthulu announced. "All in favor of removing humans from all peacekeeping and mediation roles in the Galactic Council, and formally censuring the human government for seditious behavior?" Sarah could not believe what was happening. She had just proven that the tall grays were criminals, and instead of punishing them, the Council was going to punish humans instead. The voting began. Each species had one vote, no matter how big or small they were. The results appeared on the big screen. 847 votes to remove humans from their peacekeeping roles. Only one vote against it. The small, furry squeakers had voted to support humans, but they were the only ones. Sarah looked around the room at all the beings she had helped over the years. The reptilian sovereignty delegates she had saved from 3 different wars. The Aquatic Federation representatives whose trade disputes she had solved. The insectoid swarm speakers whose territorial problems she had fixed. They had all voted against her. She felt something she had never felt before in all her years as a diplomat. She felt completely alone and completely angry at the same time. Sarah gathered her papers and put them in her bag. She unplugged her data pad and put it away. Then she stood up and looked around the room one more time. Every eye, mechanical sensor, and light pattern was focused on her. "The human government officially withdraws from the Galactic Council," she said in a clear, strong voice. "We will no longer provide peacekeeping, mediation, translation, or diplomatic services to any council member species. Good luck solving your problems without us." She turned around and walked toward the exit. Her footsteps echoed in the silent room as 1,847 different species watched her leave. The huge metal doors closed behind her with a deep, final sound. In space stations all around the galaxy, human diplomats received the same message at the same time. "Pack everything. We are going home. The galaxy has chosen to reject our help. Now they can see what life is like without us." 3 days after Ambassador Sarah Chen walked out of the Galactic Council building, the first real problem started. It was a small problem at first, the kind that humans had been fixing quietly for hundreds of years. But now, there were no humans left to fix it. The Crystalline Concordat and the Biomechanical Collective had been arguing about mining rights on a small asteroid. The asteroid had valuable metals that both species needed for their technology. Before humans left, this kind of argument would have been solved in one afternoon by a human mediator. The mediator would have sat down with both groups and listened to their concerns. They would have asked simple questions like, how much metal do you really need, and can you share the mining work? Then they would have helped both sides find a fair solution that made everyone happy. But now there were no human mediators. Instead, the two species tried to solve the problem themselves. The Crystalline Concordat sent a message to the Biomechanical Collective. The message was written in formal council language, which was very difficult to understand. It said, "Your recent territorial expansion activities in Sector 7G demonstrate aggressive economic parasitism that threatens the fundamental resource allocation balance required for sustainable galactic development." The Biomechanical Collective received this message and put it through their computer translation systems. But their computers only understood the basic words, not the real meaning behind them. The computers told the collective leaders that the crystallines had called them aggressive and parasites. The Biomechanical Collective was very insulted. They sent back their own message. "Your accusation protocols are incorrect. Our expansion activities follow all council regulations. Your resistance to our legal activities suggests anti-synthetic bias and economic protectionism." The crystallines received this message and became angry too. They thought the collective had accused them of being racist against artificial life forms and of trying to control trade unfairly. Both sides kept sending messages back and forth, and each message made them angrier than the last. Neither side understood what the other side really meant, because they did not have humans to explain it to them. Within 24 hours, both species had called their military fleets and positioned them around the disputed asteroid. What started as a simple disagreement about mining rights had become a dangerous military standoff. News of this conflict spread quickly through the galaxy's communication networks. Other species watched in shock as two normally peaceful groups prepared for war over a misunderstanding. But this was just the beginning. On the fourth day after humans left, the Reptilian Sovereignty decided to blockade 3 planets owned by the Mammalian Alliance. The Reptilians said this was punishment for historical terraforming violations that happened 200 years ago. Terraforming was the process of changing a planet's environment to make it suitable for different types of life. 2 centuries ago, the Mammalian Alliance had changed the atmosphere of some planets to have more oxygen. This made the planets perfect for mammal species, but harder for reptile species to live on. Humans had solved this old argument years ago by helping both species create special areas on each planet where different types of beings could live comfortably, but the reptilians had never really forgotten their anger about losing those planets. They had just been quiet about it because humans were there to keep peace. Now that humans were gone, old anger came back like a fire that had been sleeping under ashes. The Mammalian Alliance was shocked by the blockade. They sent urgent messages to the Galactic Council asking for help. But the Council was still in chaos from the vote 3 days earlier. Chancellor Vex Thulu was trying to maintain control, but many species were questioning his authority after the truth about the fake attacks had been revealed. The Council called an emergency meeting to discuss the reptile-mammal conflict. But without human translators and mediators, the meeting was a disaster. Representatives from 47 different species tried to speak at the same time. The automatic translation computers could not keep up with so many different languages being spoken together. Half the delegates could not understand what the other half was saying. The geometric hierarchy delegate tried to solve the problem using mathematical equations, but most species could not understand advanced mathematics. The gaseous collective representative kept changing form and speaking in chemical sense, which the translation systems could not interpret at all. The insectoid swarm speaker made clicking and buzzing sounds that meant different things depending on the speed and rhythm, but the computers just translated everything as agreement or disagreement. After 6 hours of confusion, Chancellor Vex Thulu ended the meeting without solving anything. The Reptilian Sovereignty continued their blockade, and the Mammalian Alliance began preparing their own military response. By the end of the first week, 17 different conflicts had started across the galaxy. Some were territorial disputes that had been frozen for centuries. Others were trade arguments that had escalated into economic warfare. A few were completely new problems caused by species misunderstanding each other's messages. The Aquatic Federation and the Desert Confederacy started fighting over water rights on border worlds. The Energy Beings and the Dark Matter Collective began competing aggressively for the same energy sources. Even the normally peaceful Garden Worlds Alliance had conflicts with the Silicon Valley Network over agricultural techniques. The galaxy's communication networks were overwhelmed with urgent messages, military alerts, and diplomatic protests. News reporters from different species tried to cover all the conflicts, but they often misunderstood what was happening and made the problems worse with incorrect reports. Space traffic control became a nightmare. Human controllers had been managing the complex job of organizing millions of ships traveling between star systems. They had prevented accidents, organized efficient routes, and made sure everyone followed safety rules. Now, with humans gone, ship captains had to navigate by themselves, using old emergency procedures. Collision alarms went off constantly as ships nearly crashed into each other. Trade routes that had been safe and reliable for centuries became dangerous and unpredictable. Insurance companies that protected cargo shipments started canceling policies because space travel had become too risky. This made shipping costs much higher, which hurt the economy of every species in the galaxy. The Squeakers, the only species that had voted to support humans, tried their best to help with mediation. But they were very small, only about 3 feet tall, and they spoke in high-pitched voices that many species found difficult to take seriously. The Squeaker representative, Ambassador Pipsqueak, worked 18 hours a day trying to solve conflicts between other species. But they were not trained for this kind of work, and they did not have the special human ability to understand different cultures and find compromise solutions. After one particularly difficult mediation session between the crystallines and the collective, Ambassador Pipsqueak collapsed from exhaustion and had to be taken to the medical bay. Meanwhile, every human diplomatic post, space station, and peacekeeping base in the galaxy was being packed up. Human families who had lived on alien worlds for generations gathered their belongings and prepared to return to human space. The process was organized and efficient. Humans did not destroy anything or take revenge on the species that had voted against them. They simply collected their possessions, completed their current projects as best they could, and left detailed reports about any ongoing issues that would need attention. But those reports were written in human language and human thinking patterns. When other species tried to read them, they found the information almost impossible to understand. Humans had a way of explaining complex situations that made sense to other humans but confused everyone else. As the last human ships left their posts and headed back toward Earth space, the galaxy began to realize how much work humans had been doing behind the scenes. There were thousands of small jobs that humans had been handling automatically, things so routine that other species had never even noticed them happening. Computer systems that humans had programmed started having problems. Without maintenance, safety protocols began failing. Economic calculations that humans had been checking became inaccurate. Environmental controls on space stations began having errors. It was like a huge machine that had been running smoothly for 300 years. Suddenly losing all its most important parts at the same time. Chancellor Vex Thulu called another emergency council session to discuss the growing crisis. This time, only half the species showed up. The other half were too busy dealing with their own conflicts to attend meetings. Those who did attend spent most of the time arguing about who was to blame for the current situation. Some blamed the Tall Greys for creating the fake attacks. Others blamed humans for leaving when the galaxy needed them most. A few blamed the council system itself for allowing the crisis to happen. But while they argued, the problems kept getting worse. Every day brought news of new conflicts, economic disruptions, and systems failures. The galaxy was learning a hard lesson about the difference between taking something for granted and truly appreciating its value. Humans had 1 month after humans left the Galactic Council, the galaxy was falling apart faster than anyone had thought possible. What started as a few small arguments had grown into 3 major wars and dozens of smaller conflicts. Every day brought news, of more problems that nobody knew how to solve. The worst part was that nobody really understood how bad things had become until the Geometric Collective published their report. The Geometric Collective was a species that lived for mathematics and precise calculations. They measured everything and could predict patterns better than any other species in the galaxy. Their report was terrifying in its simplicity. Before humans left, the average time to solve a galactic conflict was 3.7 days. After humans left, the average time became 247 days, but only when conflicts actually got solved at all. Most of the time, problems just kept getting bigger until they turned into wars. The report showed that humans had been preventing an average of 43 potential conflicts every single day. Small disagreements that could have grown into major problems were being stopped before they could cause damage. Trade disputes were being solved before they hurt the economy. Cultural misunderstandings were being fixed before they created hatred between species. Without humans, all these small problems were growing into big ones. It was like a forest where small fires had been put out regularly for 300 years. Now, with no firefighters, every small spark was becoming a massive blaze. The Geometric Collective's computers calculated that if the current pattern continued, the galaxy would be in a state of total war within 6 months. Not just some species fighting each other, but every species fighting every other species about everything. Chancellor Vex Thulu tried to dismiss the report as mathematical speculation, but even his own advisors were getting worried. The tall gray hegemony was facing rebellion from smaller species that had always been under their protection. These smaller species were asking a very uncomfortable question. If the tall grays were such good leaders, why had they driven away the only species that actually kept peace in the galaxy? The rebellion started with the tiny builders, a species of small insect-like beings who built amazing technology, despite being only 6 inches tall. The tiny builders had always been loyal to the tall grays, because humans had helped negotiate a protection agreement between them decades ago. But now the tiny builders were asking why they should follow leaders who had lied about human crimes and then punished humans for proving the truth. They announced that they were leaving the tall gray hegemony and would govern themselves from now on. 3 other small species followed the tiny builders' example within days. The tall gray hegemony was breaking apart from the inside, just when they needed unity to deal with the galactic crisis. Meanwhile, the economic situation was becoming desperate. The great trade network that humans had built and maintained for 2 centuries was collapsing piece by piece. The trade network was incredibly complex. It connected thousands of different worlds, each with their own products, needs, and economic systems. Humans had spent generations learning about every species' culture, psychology, and business practices. They knew which species could be trusted with credit, which ones needed immediate payment, and how to write contracts that everyone understood. Without humans managing these relationships, trade agreements started falling apart. Species that had worked together for decades suddenly could not trust each other. Contract disputes that would have been solved in hours by human arbitrators became lengthy legal battles that sometimes ended in trade wars. The Crystalline Concordat, which exported beautiful crystal art objects, found that their trade partners were demanding immediate payment instead of accepting the credit arrangements they had used for 50 years. But the crystallines needed time to create their art, and immediate payment meant they could not afford to buy the raw materials they needed. The Biomechanical Collective had the opposite problem. They produced goods very quickly using automated factories, but their customers wanted time to pay after receiving the products. Without humans to guarantee these payment arrangements, the collective had to demand money up front, which made their prices too high for most customers. Shipping became increasingly dangerous as the conflicts spread. Insurance companies that protected cargo ships started canceling policies faster than new ones could be written. The cost of shipping goods between star systems increased by 300% in just 4 weeks. Some trade routes became completely unusable because they passed through areas where species were fighting. Other routes became overcrowded as everyone tried to use the few safe paths that remained, leading to traffic jams, accidents, and more conflicts. The situation was made worse by technical failures that humans would have prevented. The galaxy's Communication networks started having problems because human technicians were no longer available to maintain the complex systems that allowed different technologies to work together. The quantified mind species, who existed as pure information in computer networks, found that their messages were being corrupted when they traveled through systems designed for biological species. The energy beings discovered that their communications were interfering with the electrical systems used by mechanical species. The telepathic collective could not send thoughts to species that did not have the right kind of brain structure. Before humans left, there had been translation protocols that allowed all these different types of beings to communicate clearly. Humans had spent decades developing these protocols, testing them, and fixing problems as they arose. Now, without maintenance, the systems were breaking down. Misunderstandings that would have been funny in peaceful times became serious diplomatic incidents. The harmonic symphony species, who communicated through musical tones, accidentally sent a message that sounded like a war song to the rhythm nations. The rhythm nations responded with their own battle music, which the harmonic symphony interpreted as a declaration of war. What should have been resolved with a simple explanation became a week-long crisis that required military intervention to prevent actual fighting. The most serious conflict was the Spiral Arm War, which started when the Silicate Empire and the Gas Giant Federation could not agree on navigation rights through a region of space that both species used regularly. For decades, humans had managed an informal schedule that let both species use the space lanes without interfering with each other. The Silicate Empire used heavy, slow ships that needed wide paths and lots of time to maneuver. The Gas Giant Federation used fast, flexible ships that could change direction quickly, but needed specific gravity conditions to navigate safely. Human traffic controllers had coordinated these different needs automatically, making sure that slow, silicate ships had clear paths during certain time periods, while gas giant ships used the same routes when conditions were optimal for their navigation systems. Without human coordination, both species tried to use the routes at the same time. Silicate ships were too slow to get out of the way when fast gas giant ships approached. Gas giant ships could not navigate safely around the slow-moving silicate vessels. Several near collisions led to angry accusations from both sides. The Silicate Empire claimed that the Gas Giant Federation was being reckless and dangerous. The Gas Giant Federation accused the Silicate Empire of deliberately blocking their routes. Within 2 weeks, both species had sent military fleets to protect their shipping. The military ships made the situation worse because now there were even more vessels trying to use the same space, and the military commanders from both species did not trust each other enough to coordinate their movements. The first actual battle happened when a gas giant patrol ship tried to escort one of their cargo vessels through a route that was occupied by a silicate military convoy. Neither side wanted to back down, and neither side could communicate effectively with the other. The battle itself was brief, but it marked the beginning of the first major war since humans had left. Within days, other species were choosing sides, based on old alliances, trade relationships, and ancient grudges that had nothing to do with the original navigation dispute. The Squeakers tried desperately to mediate the conflict, but they were overwhelmed. Ambassador Pipsqueak worked so hard that they collapsed again and had to be hospitalized for exhaustion. The other Squeaker diplomats were doing their best, but they simply did not have the training, experience, or natural abilities that humans had brought to peacekeeping. Back on Earth, human leaders watched the galactic news with a mixture of sadness and resignation. They had known this would happen eventually, but seeing it unfold so quickly was still painful. President Martinez of the Earth Federation called a meeting of the Human Diplomatic Corps. Former ambassadors, mediators, and peacekeepers gathered to discuss whether humanity should try to help despite being officially rejected by the galaxy. We could send unofficial advisors, suggested former Ambassador Chen, who had been the one to walk out of the council chambers. Small teams that work behind the scenes to prevent the worst disasters. No, replied Director Hassan, who had managed human peacekeeping operations for 20 years. If we rescue them from this crisis, they will never learn to solve problems themselves. They will just expect us to fix. 2 months after humans walked away from the Galactic Council, the situation had become so bad that even the most stubborn species were starting to panic. The spiral arm war was spreading like a disease, infecting more star systems every day. What had started as a simple disagreement about shipping routes was now a massive conflict, involving dozens of species and hundreds of worlds. The war had grown because species kept choosing sides based on old friendships and ancient grudges rather than trying to understand what the fight was actually about. The reptilian sovereignty joined the Silicate Empire because they had fought together in wars centuries ago. The mammalian alliance supported the gas giant Federation because they both breathed oxygen and felt they had something in common. Soon, species that had nothing to do with the original navigation dispute were shooting at each other across half the galaxy. Solar systems that had been peaceful for generations became battlefields. Trade routes that had carried goods safely for centuries were now filled with warships and debris from destroyed vessels. The economic damage was catastrophic. The Galactic Trade Index, which measured the overall health of commerce across all species, had dropped to its lowest level in recorded history. Entire industries were shutting down because they could not get the materials they needed or safely transport their products to customers. The Crystal Gardens of Luminara, which had been one of the galaxy's most popular tourist destinations, closed down because no travel companies were willing to guarantee safe passage through the war zones. The famous floating markets of Nebula 7, where species from across the galaxy had traded exotic goods for over 500 years, became empty and abandoned as merchants fled to safer regions. Food shortages began appearing on worlds that depended on imports from other star systems. The agricultural planets that fed much of the galaxy were either in war zones or cut off by military blockades. Species that had not grown their own food for generations suddenly faced the possibility of starvation. Medical supplies became critically short when the pharmaceutical collective's production facilities were destroyed in a bombing raid that was supposed to target military installations. The attack was carried out by automated weapons that could not tell the difference between a hospital and an army base, because the targeting systems had been designed by species that did not understand each other's architecture. On the political front, the Galactic Council was in complete chaos. Chancellor Vexathulu was facing a vote of no confidence from his own supporters. The species that had voted to remove humans were now blaming each other for the crisis. Emergency sessions were called every day, but each meeting ended in more arguments and no solutions. The smaller species that had always relied on council protection were the first to break ranks. The tiny builders had already left the tall gray. Hegemony and now other small species were following their example. The flower people, who were plant-based beings that needed very specific environmental conditions to survive, announced that they were withdrawing from all military alliances and declaring themselves neutral in all conflicts. The numerical monks, who spent most of their time calculating mathematical proofs, said they were tired of irrational political behavior and would only participate in council discussions that followed logical problem-solving protocols. Since most council meetings had become emotional shouting matches, this meant the numerical monks stopped attending altogether. Even some of the larger, more powerful species were starting to have second thoughts about their decision to drive away humans. The Biomechanical Collective published a statistical analysis showing that their conflict resolution success rate had dropped by 89% since humans left. The energy beings admitted in a public statement that they may have underestimated the practical value of human mediation services, but the most significant change came from an unexpected source: the Squeakers. Ambassador Pipsqueak had recovered from their exhaustion and was back at work, but they had learned some hard lessons from their failed attempts to replace human mediators. In a speech to the remaining council members, they said something that shocked everyone. "We have been trying to do the job that humans did, but we cannot do it the same way they did. We are not humans. We do not think like humans. We do not understand other species the way humans understood them. The truth is that humans were not just good at making peace. They were the only species that was good at it. And we threw them away because we were jealous and stupid." The Squeaker's honesty was like a cold splash of water on the council's face. For the first time since the crisis began, a species had admitted the truth. Humans had not been doing an ordinary job that anyone could learn to do. They had been doing something that required special abilities that only humans possessed. This realization led to the most desperate decision in Galactic Council history. After weeks of bitter debate, the Council voted to send a formal apology mission to human space. The mission would be led by Chancellor Vex Thulu himself, despite the fact that he was the one who had started the whole crisis, with his false accusations against humans. The decision to send Vex Thulu was controversial, even among his supporters. Many species felt that he was the wrong person to apologize for a problem he had created, but others argued that sending the highest-ranking council official showed how seriously they took the situation. The apology mission was the largest diplomatic convoy in galactic history. Representatives from all 847 council member species joined the fleet, even those who were currently at war with each other. For the journey to human space, enemies agreed to temporary ceasefires so they could travel together. The convoy included everything the council could think of to show their sincerity. There were gifts of rare artwork, scientific discoveries, technological innovations, and cultural treasures from every member species. There were formal documents of apology written in hundreds of different languages. There were even offers to give humans special privileges and authority that no species had ever been offered before. But the most important part of the convoy was the delegation of witnesses. These were representatives from species that had been helped by humans over the centuries. They carried records of every conflict humans had prevented, every war they had ended, every economic disaster they had averted. The witnesses were there to testify about the value of human contributions to galactic civilization. The convoy took 3 weeks to reach the edge of human space, traveling through regions that were increasingly dangerous as the conflicts spread. They had to detour around several active battle zones and request safe passage from military commanders who were more interested in fighting than diplomacy. When they finally arrived at the border of human territory, they were met by a single human patrol ship. The contrast was striking. 847 different species in hundreds of vessels, facing one small human ship with a crew of 12 people. The captain of the human ship was Maria Santos, who had been a council liaison before humans withdrew. She had worked with many of the species in the convoy and knew most of their representatives personally. This made the conversation more painful for everyone involved. Chancellor Vex Thulu opened communications and began reading from a prepared speech about the Council's regret and their urgent need for human assistance, but Captain Santos interrupted him before he could finish. "Chancellor," she said, "I'm going to save us all some time. We know why you're here, we know what you want, and the answer is no." The silence that followed was so complete that people later said you could hear the cosmic background radiation humming through the communication systems. Captain Santos, Chancellor Vex Thulu tried again. "Surely you understand the gravity of the situation. Entire civilizations are at risk. Millions of beings are suffering. The galaxy needs human help to prevent a complete collapse of interstellar society." "The galaxy had human help," Captain Santos replied calmly. "For 300 years, humans gave everything we had to keep peace and prevent exactly this kind of crisis. And when we proved that you had lied about us and betrayed us, your response was to punish us for telling the truth. You made your choice. Now you have to live with it." The convoy delegates began transmitting their prepared arguments and pleas. Some offered humans vast amounts of money and resources. Others promised to make humans the official leaders of galactic peacekeeping. With unprecedented authority, a few species offered to become human colonies in exchange for protection from the ongoing wars. But Captain Santos had more news to deliver, and this news was even more devastating than her refusal to help. "There's something else you should know," she continued. "In the 2 months since we left the Council, we've been contacted by 43 species that were never part of your organization. Species from other regions of the galaxy who heard about the situation and wanted to work with us." She paused to let this information sink in before delivering the final blow. "We've accepted diplomatic relations with 12 of these species and have begun building a new alliance with them. The Frontier Alliance, we're calling it. These species treat us as partners, not servants. They respect our contributions and value our expertise. And unlike the Council species, they actually listen when we give advice instead of ignoring it until a crisis. 6 months after humans walked away from the Galactic Council, the old order of the galaxy had completely collapsed. The great civilization that had lasted for thousands of years was now just a memory, replaced by a chaotic collection of warring species and failed states. The Galactic Council building still stood on the neutral world of Harmony Station, but it was now mostly empty. The grand chamber where 847 different species had once gathered to make decisions affecting trillions of beings was used only once or twice a month, and even then, fewer than half the member species bothered to send representatives. Chancellor Vex Thulu had been removed from office 3 months earlier. He was replaced by a rotating system where different species took turns being in charge for a few weeks at a time. But this system was a disaster because each new leader tried to reverse everything the previous leader had done, creating constant confusion and contradictory policies. The tall, gray hegemony, which had once been the most powerful political force in the galaxy, had broken apart completely. The smaller species that had been under their protection had either declared independence or joined other alliances. The tall grays themselves were now split into dozens of competing factions, each claiming to be the legitimate government. Some of these factions had tried to restart relationships with humans, sending small diplomatic missions to human space with apologies and offers of cooperation. But humans had established a clear policy. They would not work with any species that had voted to expel them from the council. This meant that almost all of the old council members were permanently excluded from human partnerships. The wars that had started in the first months after humans left had grown into something much worse than anyone had expected. The Spiral Arm War had spread to cover nearly a quarter of the galaxy. But it was no longer really one war. It was dozens of separate conflicts that overlapped and interfered with each other in confusing ways. Species that had been allies for centuries were now enemies because of misunderstandings that humans would have prevented. Ancient territorial disputes that had been peacefully frozen for generations had erupted into violence. New conflicts appeared every week as species tried to take advantage of the chaos to settle old scores or grab resources from weakened neighbors. The economic situation was even worse than the military situation. The great trade network that humans had spent 2 centuries building and maintaining had completely fallen apart. Trade between species had dropped to less than 20% of pre-crisis levels. Many species were trying to become self-sufficient, but this was impossible for civilizations that had specialized in specific industries for hundreds of years. The crystalline Concordat, which had focused entirely on creating beautiful art objects, could not produce the basic technology they needed for their daily lives. The Biomechanical Collective, which specialized in manufacturing, could not grow enough food to feed their population. The Gas Giant Federation, which harvested rare gases from their homeworlds, had no way to obtain solid materials for construction. Without human-managed trade relationships, these species could not work together to meet each other's needs. They had forgotten how to negotiate fair exchanges, how to build trust with trading partners, and how to resolve the inevitable disputes that arose in complex commercial relationships. The result was widespread shortages, economic collapse, and social unrest on thousands of worlds. Species that had enjoyed high standards of living for generations were now struggling to meet basic needs. Unemployment was massive as industries shut down due to lack of materials or customers. Social safety nets that had existed for centuries were overwhelmed and failing. Some species tried to solve these problems through military conquest, attacking their neighbors to steal resources or territory. Others tried isolation, cutting off all contact with the outside galaxy and hoping to survive on their own. A few attempted to recreate the old human systems using their own people, but these efforts failed because other species simply did not have the unique combination of traits that had made humans effective mediators. The Squeakers had become the unofficial historians of the galactic collapse. Ambassador Pipsqueak, who had recovered fully from their earlier exhaustion, spent their time documenting the crisis for future study. Their reports made for disturbing reading. According to Squeaker records, humans had been quietly preventing, or solving an average of 43 potential galactic incidents every day. These were mostly small problems, trade disputes, navigation conflicts, cultural misunderstandings, resource allocation disagreements that could have grown into major crises if left unattended. Without human intervention, all of these small problems were becoming big problems. It was like a dam that had been holding back a river for centuries, suddenly breaking all at once. The flood of unresolved conflicts was overwhelming the galaxy's ability to cope. But the most painful part of the Squeaker reports was the documentation of how routine and automatic human peacekeeping had become. Other species had taken it so completely for granted that they had stopped noticing it was happening. They had assumed that peace was the natural state of the galaxy, not something that required constant work and attention to maintain. The reports also revealed something that shocked even the Squeakers. Humans had been doing far more than just official mediation and peacekeeping. They had been quietly managing thousands of informal relationships, preventing problems before they became serious enough to require formal intervention. Human merchants had served as informal ambassadors, building personal relationships between species. Human scientists had facilitated knowledge sharing that prevented technological conflicts. Human tourists had created cultural bridges that reduced xenophobia and misunderstanding. Human students studying on alien worlds had become unofficial cultural translators. All of this informal diplomacy had disappeared when humans withdrew from galactic society. The result was not just the loss of professional peacekeepers, but the loss of thousands of small connections that had helped different species understand and trust each other. Meanwhile, reports about human activities outside the old council territory were both fascinating and depressing for the council species. The frontier alliance that humans had formed with non-council species was growing rapidly and achieving remarkable success. The alliance now included 23 different species, and they had accomplished more in 6 months than the old council had managed in decades. They had developed new technologies through genuine cooperation instead of competitive secrecy. They had created more efficient trade systems based on mutual benefit rather than political manipulation. They had even established the first truly universal translation protocols that worked effectively for all member species. What made these achievements even more impressive was that many of the Frontier Alliance species had been considered primitive or backwards by Council standards. They were species that the Council had either ignored or looked down upon. But working with humans as equals, they had revealed capabilities and insights that the Council had never bothered to discover. The harmonic builders, for example, were a species that communicated through complex musical patterns. The Council had always found them difficult to work with because their music-based language was hard to translate. But humans had developed ways to understand and respond to musical communication, and it turned out that the harmonic builders were brilliant engineers whose architectural techniques could solve problems that had puzzled other species for centuries. The Yine. Quantum dreamers were a species that existed partially in alternate dimensions. The Council had considered them too strange and unpredictable to work with seriously. But humans had learned to communicate with beings who thought in multiple realities simultaneously, and the quantum dreamers had shared technologies that allowed faster-than-light communication across vast distances. Each new member of the Frontier Alliance brought unique capabilities that complemented those of other members. Under human guidance, these species were learning to work together in ways that multiplied their individual strengths instead of competing over their differences. The contrast with the Council territory was stark. While the Alliance species were achieving new heights of cooperation and prosperity, the Council species were sinking deeper into conflict and economic collapse. Some of the more forward-thinking Council species began to realize that they were witnessing the birth of a new galactic power that might eventually surpass the old Council civilization. The Frontier Alliance controlled fewer star systems and had a smaller population than the Council, but they were growing rapidly and seemed to have unlimited potential for development. There were rumors that several Council species were secretly negotiating with the Alliance, hoping to switch sides before it was too late. But these negotiations were complicated by the human policy of not working with species that had participated in their expulsion from the Council. A few species that had abstained from the expulsion vote or had voted against it were accepted into Alliance membership. The Squeakers were the first to be admitted, and their membership was celebrated as a reward for their loyalty to humans and their honest documentation of the crisis.